By 2014, Mercedes had built a car so dominant that two of the world's best drivers were racing in identical machines. Lewis Hamilton arrived from McLaren carrying 3 world championships and a reputation for raw speed that few drivers had ever matched. Nico Rosberg was talented and determined, but most people in the paddock didn't give him a serious chance of closing the gap. From 2014 to 2015, Hamilton made it look straightforward. 2 consecutive titles. More victories, more points, more control of the narrative. Rosberg finished second both years, respectable for most, but a ceiling for someone with championship ambitions. By mid-2015, the media had quietly moved on from the question of whether Rosberg could beat Hamilton. The new question was when Hamilton would leave Mercedes for a new challenge. The assumption was settled. What the paddock missed was this. Rosberg wasn't reacting to those defeats with frustration. He was cataloging them. He was systematically mapping Hamilton's approach, his reliance on raw speed, his patterns under pressure, his tendency to treat dominance as a given after early season success. At the same time, Rosberg was auditing his own weaknesses, where he was losing time, where his race strategy was inconsistent, what mental habits were holding him back. By the time 2016 began, Hamilton had no reason to think anything had changed. Rosberg's first advantage wasn't technical. It was psychological. Hamilton operated under a worldview reinforced by years of success. He was naturally faster, more talented, built for this. That belief had made him one of the most dangerous drivers on the grid. But it also made him predictable in subtle ways. When he won, it confirmed what he already believed. When he lost, which was rare, he framed it as a variable beyond his control. Engine failure, a strategy call, a fortunate overtake. His mind resisted the conclusion that he had simply been outdriven. Rosberg decided to challenge that framework from the first day of the new year. In preseason testing, he posted lap times faster than Hamilton, not occasionally, but consistently, session after session. By the time the championship started, genuine doubt had entered Hamilton's mind, and with it came something he rarely experienced: uncertainty in qualifying. The psychological importance of this is difficult to overstate. Once Hamilton began questioning whether Rosberg might actually be faster, the dynamic changed in both directions. Hamilton started pressing, pushing margins he didn't need to push, committing small errors that a fully confident Hamilton wouldn't make. Rosberg, in contrast, was consolidating belief. Rosberg had identified something specific about Hamilton's psychology. He handled direct competition well, but struggled under sustained, accumulated pressure. Not a single bad weekend, which could be written off. The weight of knowing, week after week, that your teammate was matching or beating you, that the story was reversing, so Rosberg produced exactly that. In qualifying, the single clearest head-to-head metric available, he was relentless. He won 10 consecutive qualifying sessions at the start of the season. That's not circumstantial. That's a systematic, deliberate campaign to dismantle an opponent's confidence by showing up or at the same fuel load and in the same conditions, and coming out ahead every time. In races, you can attribute a result to strategy, tire temperature, traffic, pit stop timing. Qualifying strips all of that away. And in that unmediated test, Hamilton kept coming up short. The second part of Rosberg's approach was technical, but not in the obvious sense. Mercedes provided both drivers with identical cars. The difference was in how each driver chose to work with theirs. From 2014 to 2015, both Rosberg and Hamilton operated from the same philosophy: push to the absolute limit, extract every tenth available, let raw talent settle the outcome. That approach favored Hamilton. In a pure limit-pushing contest, the naturally faster driver wins more often than not. Rosberg recognized this and changed the terms. Working closely with his race engineer, he built a car that didn't need to operate on the ragged edge to be competitive. The priority was predictability, a car that was stable, forgiving, and controllable at high speed. A setup that allowed deeper braking without the risk of locking tires, that managed tire temperature more naturally, that rewarded consistency rather than demanding absolute precision at every corner. Across a 21-race season decided by reliability and points accumulation, this philosophy had measurable consequences. Fewer lockups, fewer mistakes, fewer retirements, more second-place finishes on weekends where winning wasn't possible. The data across the season reflected it. Rosberg finished ahead on points in 13 of 21 races. That's not the outcome of superior pace. It's the outcome of a deliberate setup strategy designed around the structure of a championship. Hamilton wanted to extract the maximum from his car in every session. Rosberg built a car he could drive consistently across a full season. Two different approaches. And in 2016, the latter was more effective. Rosberg's third advantage was strategic, and it operated at the level of the full season rather than any individual race. He won the opening 4 races: Australia, Bahrain, China, Russia, with a run of early dominance that immediately shifted the championship narrative. By the time Hamilton recorded his first win of the year, Rosberg was already the points leader. Hamilton spent the rest of the season in recovery mode, reacting rather than setting the agenda. Even in the races that followed, when Hamilton was matching Rosberg's pace and winning Sundays, the deficit was already built. Rosberg carried a points lead that Hamilton could never quite erase. Beyond the early run, Rosberg's strategic thinking operated at a subtler level. He was prepared for the reality that across 21 races there would be weekends where Hamilton was simply quicker. Rather than forcing the issue on those weekends, he managed his losses with precision, finishing second, when he might have finished fifth, conceding 4 points instead of 8. It wasn't dramatic, it never made headlines. But over the course of a full season, it determined the championship margin. Hamilton drove every race as a standalone event, committing everything. Rosberg drove each race with the full 21-round arc in mind, allocating his risk accordingly. The pattern was consistent. When Hamilton won, Rosberg almost always finished second. When Rosberg won, Hamilton's finishing positions were less reliable. That wasn't coincidence. By mid-season, Rosberg had studied Hamilton's approach so thoroughly that he could anticipate his defensive lines, his preferred braking points, his patterns under pressure. He wasn't racing Hamilton reactively. He was one step ahead. Alongside the competitive strategy, something shifted in Rosberg personally. Coming into 2016, he carried 3 years of second-place finishes, and with them, a partially internalized belief that second place was his ceiling. It wasn't overt, but it was there. What changed wasn't desperation. Desperation makes drivers reckless. What changed was clarity. Rosberg concluded that 2016 represented a specific, non-recurring opportunity. Mercedes wouldn't maintain this level of dominance indefinitely. Regulatory changes were approaching. Hamilton wouldn't stay at the team forever. The window was closing, and he understood it clearly. That recognition, not panic but clarity about timing, restructured how he approached every element of his preparation. He rebuilt his fitness program from the ground up, targeting the specific physical and cognitive demands of Formula One. He became methodical about sleep, nutrition, and recovery to a degree that stood in visible contrast to Hamilton's more relaxed off-track manner. He eliminated anything that wasn't directly serving the objective. The most significant change was in how he studied data. Previously, Rosberg focused primarily on his own lap traces, comparing his own performance session to session, looking for tenths he was losing to himself. In 2016, he shifted the analysis to Hamilton. Where was Hamilton strong and where was he vulnerable? On which circuits and at which corners did Rosberg hold a comparative advantage? What were Hamilton's braking markers, and how did they diverge from Rosberg's own? Where could different technique translate into competitive gain? The underlying shift in orientation was this: Hamilton was trying to extract the maximum from the car and the circuit. Rosberg was trying to beat Hamilton specifically. One is about perfection. The other is about competition. And Rosberg stopped accepting second place internally, not just on the timing sheets, but in how he thought about himself in relation to Hamilton. He stopped treating Hamilton's superiority as given. That shift changed how he operated in the garage, how he communicated with his engineers, how he carried himself across a race weekend. The pressure across the 2016 season built differently for each driver. For Hamilton, it was unfamiliar. He had never lost a championship battle from a position of expected dominance. For Rosberg, pressure had the opposite effect. It sharpened him. In Spain, at turn 1 on the opening lap, the two made contact. Both cars retired. Mercedes investigated and classified it as a racing incident. What it demonstrated, regardless of cause, was that Rosberg was no longer deferring. He wasn't managing his position relative to Hamilton. He was competing for it, without reservation. But later in the season at Baku and elsewhere, the tension between them became increasingly visible. Hamilton was unsettled in ways that had never been apparent before. Rosberg, meanwhile, was operating from a place that observers described as freedom. A driver with nothing to protect, competing against someone who had everything to defend. For 3 years, Rosberg had treated Hamilton with a respect that bordered on deference. By mid-2016, that was entirely absent. He was racing Hamilton as a rival, not as a teammate. And Hamilton, whose entire psychological structure as a competitor was built on the certainty that he was the faster driver, was facing someone who no longer accepted that premise. When Rosberg clinched the title in Mexico with 2 races remaining, it wasn't a surprise to anyone who had watched the season closely. The only genuine shock came 5 days later, when Rosberg announced his retirement at 31, at the peak of his career, having just won the World Championship. What Rosberg's 2016 campaign demonstrates, and why it holds up as something more than a one-season story, is that it was not a case of a faster driver beating a slower one. Hamilton and Rosberg were separated on a given day by tenths or hundredths of a second. Either could win. The margin between them was real, but narrow. Rosberg won the championship through 5 interlocking elements. He conducted a methodical psychological campaign, consistently undermining Hamilton's baseline certainty that he was the naturally superior driver. He adopted a technical philosophy, reliability, and consistency over peak performance that suited the structure of a 21-race season better than Hamilton's approach. He managed the championship as a single connected arc, not as a sequence of isolated events. And he controlled momentum through the early season in a way that Hamilton never fully recovered from. He underwent a genuine personal transformation, shifting his self-conception from Hamilton's teammate to Hamilton's rival, a distinction that changed how he competed in every session. And he brought a level of preparation and focus in the off-season that reflected his understanding that the window was narrow and closing. After winning, Rosberg retired. He had beaten Lewis Hamilton. Not through luck, not through a superior car, not through an obvious talent advantage. He had done it through preparation, strategy, psychology, and clarity of purpose. Having achieved that, he chose to stop.